In the final desperate months of World War II, two legendary titans of the battlefield, General George S. Patton and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, engaged in a high-stakes race toward the Rhine River that would define their legacies and force Winston Churchill to intervene. This is the definitive story of Operation Plunder, a secret American crossing, and a toxic rivalry that nearly fractured the Allied high command during the march into Nazi Germany. By the early spring of 1945, the Allied juggernaut had reached the doorstep of the German heartland. But between the liberating armies and total victory stood the Rhine River, a psychological and physical fortress that had served as Germany's shield for 1,000 years. Napoleon Bonaparte himself had once famously labeled this formidable water barrier as the grave of all invaders, and in 1945, it remained the final major obstacle separating the Allied divisions from the industrial center of the Third Reich. Joseph Goebbels, the architect of Nazi propaganda, had chillingly warned the German people and the world that the Rhine was the sacred moat of Fortress Germany, promising that any invading army attempting a crossing would find themselves drowned in a torrent of German blood. As the strategic situation crystallized into a deadly race by March of that year, Adolf Hitler issued a draconian order to destroy every single bridge spanning the river, a command that the Wehrmacht carried out with brutal efficiency until only a single span remained standing. While the German retreat intensified, the tension within the Allied Supreme Command reached a breaking point as two fundamentally different military philosophies collided on the banks of the river. Bernard Law Montgomery, the commander of the British 21st Army Group, viewed the Rhine crossing as a meticulously choreographed set-piece battle that required months of planning, massive artillery support, and complex airborne operations to ensure a decisive blow against the Nazi regime. Montgomery envisioned his grand undertaking, dubbed Operation Plunder, as the ultimate masterpiece of British arms, a moment where the world would witness a crushing, methodical victory that would secure Britain's place as an equal partner in the final triumph. However, standing in stark contrast was George S. Patton Jr., the commander of the United States Third Army, whose operational philosophy centered on raw speed, relentless aggression, and the immediate exploitation of every perceived enemy weakness. Patton viewed the Rhine not as a daunting obstacle requiring a full orchestra of support, but as a fleeting opportunity to prove that his American soldiers were the true masters of mobile warfare, and that he was the indispensable general of the age. The rivalry between these two men had been poisoning Allied relationships for nearly a year, with Patton privately dismissing Montgomery as an overcautious showman, while Montgomery regarded Patton as a reckless cowboy who achieved tactical success only at an inexcusable cost in human lives. Their personal diaries served as repositories for this mutual contempt, with Patton describing Montgomery as a tired little man who feared taking risks, while Montgomery informed Field Marshal Alan Brooke that Patton was fundamentally unsound and should have been removed from command months prior. Caught in the middle of this burgeoning ego clash was General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, who faced the unenviable task of balancing the overwhelming military might of the United States with the political necessities of Great Britain. By March of 1945, the United States had deployed 61 divisions to Northwest Europe, compared to Britain's 14, making the Americans the primary providers of manpower and logistics. Yet Eisenhower knew that Winston Churchill's government desperately needed victories that could be framed as British achievements to maintain domestic morale and post-war influence. The dynamics shifted dramatically on March 7th, when elements of the American 9th Armored Division managed to capture the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen before German engineers could detonate their charges, creating a sudden bridgehead on the eastern bank. Although the Remagen breakthrough was a strategic godsend for the Allies, it served only to heighten the personal frustrations of Patton and Montgomery, as neither general could claim credit for the feat, and the bridgehead was located in the American First Army's sector, far from their own planned crossing sites. Patton watched the events at Remagen with a mixture of professional joy and personal envy, fueling his determination to reach the river and cross it on his own terms before Montgomery could launch his elaborate, press-heavy spectacle in the north. By March the 21st, Patton's leading armored elements had reached the banks of the Rhine near Oppenheim, just 20 miles south of Mainz, where his intelligence staff reported that the German defenses were rapidly melting away into a state of total collapse. As entire German divisions began to surrender or vanish into the countryside, Patton saw his window of opportunity fly open, realizing that the eastern bank was held only by demoralized units and scattered remnants of the Wehrmacht. On the evening of March 21st, Patton gathered his corps commanders and issued instructions that were characteristically blunt and defiant, telling them that they were going across that very night without a big fuss or preliminary fanfare. His objective was to steal a march on the world stage, instructing his officers to get their boats and their men across the water immediately and only inform the high command once the American flag was firmly planted on the other side. Major General Hobart Gay, Patton's chief of staff, later noted that the general was grinning like a schoolboy about to pull off the prank of the century, fully aware that a quiet crossing on the 22nd would drive Montgomery absolutely insane. The assignment for this daring nighttime maneuver fell to the 5th Infantry Division, and under the cover of a pitch-black sky on the night of March 22nd and 23rd, assault boats were silently brought forward to the river's edge near Oppenheim. At precisely 10:01 p.m. on March 22nd, the first wave of American infantry pushed off from the western bank, embarking on a mission that lacked any of the traditional hallmarks of a major offensive. There was no massive preliminary bombardment to alert the enemy, no specialized airborne drops to secure the rear, and no elaborate deception plans. There were only brave infantrymen paddling across the cold Rhine in the shadows. The German reaction was sporadic, confused, and ultimately ineffective, allowing the 5th Division to ferry 2 battalions across by midnight and establish a full regiment on the eastern bank by dawn. As the sun rose on March 23rd, Patton's men were expanding their bridgehead against minimal resistance, having successfully bypassed the natural fortress that the Nazis claimed was impregnable. At 7:00 a.m., Patton placed a telephone call to his superior, Major General Omar Bradley, with a voice that was reportedly cracking with excitement and suppressed laughter. Patton gleefully informed Bradley that he had sneaked a division over the river during the night and urged Bradley to tell Montgomery to hurry up before the war ended without him. Bradley was delighted by the news, recognizing that Patton had achieved a massive propaganda coup for the United States Army while simultaneously delivering a personal humiliation to the British Field Marshal. Even as Bradley called Eisenhower to relay the news of the successful crossing, Montgomery was finalizing the preparations for his own massive show, Operation Plunder, which was scheduled to begin less than 24 hours later. Montgomery's operation was the polar opposite of Patton's stealthy crossing, involving a staggering 3,500 artillery pieces that unleashed 65,000 shells in just the first hour of the assault. The sheer scale of the bombardment was so immense that the roar of the guns could be heard in London, 400 miles away, signaling to the world that the British Empire was striking its final, heavy blow against the heart of Germany. The following morning, March 24th, witnessed the launch of Operation Varsity, which remains the largest single-day airborne operation in military history, with 16,000 paratroopers dropping east of the Rhine. Montgomery stood on the western bank of the river, surrounded by Winston Churchill, Field Marshal Alan Brooke, and a literal army of war correspondents who were there to document his moment of ultimate triumph. This was meant to be the climax of his career, the indisputable proof that British military power could still deliver a decisive, world-changing victory through superior planning and execution. However, the atmosphere at Montgomery's headquarters darkened significantly when word finally reached him that Patton had already been across the Rhine for more than 24 hours. Montgomery's initial reaction was one of flat disbelief, and when the reports were finally confirmed, his mood shifted from surprise to a cold, simmering resentment. He immediately began to downplay the American achievement, insisting to anyone who would listen that Patton's crossing simply did not count because it had been an opportunistic raid against an unopposed sector. Montgomery argued that Patton had only moved a single division across the water, whereas his own operation was a full-scale Army group maneuver designed to break the very back of the German defensive line. Winston Churchill, standing beside the Field Marshal as the sky filled with the silk of thousands of parachutes, found himself caught between celebrating a British success and managing the political fallout of Patton's earlier crossing. The Prime Minister had traveled to the front specifically to witness a British triumph that could be broadcast to a weary public back home. But now he was being told that an American general had reached the goal faster, more quietly, and with far less fanfare. The theatrical nature of the rivalry reached a fever pitch on March 25th, when Patton himself crossed the Rhine on a temporary pontoon bridge, accompanied by a swarm of photographers to ensure the moment was captured for history. Upon reaching the eastern bank, Patton performed a calculated piece of theater by deliberately losing his footing and falling to his knees, scooping up a handful of German soil in an echo of William the Conqueror's legendary landing in England in 1066. It was a move designed specifically for the headlines, and when the newspapers hit the streets the next day, the impact was exactly what Patton had intended. The media was unanimous in its coverage, declaring that Patton was the first to cross the Rhine and emphasizing that he had done so ahead of schedule and without the massive logistical overhead of the British operation to the north. Montgomery's carefully orchestrated moment was relegated to secondary status in the international press, leaving the field marshal in a state of professional agony. His response was immediate and aggressive as he began lobbying Eisenhower and the British chiefs of staff to minimize what Patton had accomplished. In a sharp cable sent to Alan Brooke on March 26th, Montgomery complained that the press was making far too much of what he called an opportunistic raid, asserting that his own operations were the ones truly breaking the German resistance. Meanwhile, Patton continued to pour gasoline on the fire during interviews with war correspondents, dismissively stating that the Rhine was just another river and no mightier than the Mississippi. Patton's comments grew increasingly pointed as he joked that while some people needed a full orchestra just to get out of bed in the morning, he only needed a bugle to win a war. He boldly claimed that the Third Army had proven that one did not need to drop 2 airborne divisions to cross a river, asserting that all that was required was a bit of guts and some good infantrymen. These biting remarks infuriated Montgomery to the point that he sent a personal message to Eisenhower on March 28th, demanding that Patton be officially censured for making statements that were prejudicial to Allied unity. Montgomery's message was scathing, characterizing Patton's behavior as that of a child seeking attention and requesting an order to stop the public comparisons between their respective operations. Eisenhower found himself in a nearly impossible position, recognizing that while Patton had clearly violated military protocol and professional decorum, Montgomery's own constant demands for primacy had become equally problematic for the coalition. The rivalry was no longer just a clash of egos between two commanders. It was threatening to erupt into a public scandal that could damage the vital relationship between the United States and Great Britain at the very moment of their shared victory. By March 30th, Churchill had returned to London from the front lines, and as he read the press coverage that unfavorably compared the massive British effort to Patton's surprise crossing, his frustration began to boil over. The Prime Minister understood that while Britain had sacrificed enormously and needed to showcase its strength, the strategic reality of American dominance could no longer be ignored or insulted by petty bickering. The diplomatic fallout of George S. Patton's surprise crossing began to ripple through the highest corridors of power in London and Washington, creating a storm of controversy that threatened to overshadow the actual military progress being made on the ground. While the American public celebrated Patton's audacity, the British military establishment felt a deep sense of betrayal, believing that the Americans were systematically undermining the prestige of the British Empire at its most vulnerable moment. Field Marshal Montgomery, still reeling from the headlines that hailed Patton as the conqueror of the Rhine, found himself increasingly isolated within the Allied command structure as his methodical approach was characterized as archaic by the aggressive American press. By late March of 1945, the friction had reached such a level that General Dwight D. Eisenhower was forced to intervene personally, attempting to soothe the bruised egos of his subordinates while maintaining the forward momentum of the entire Western Front. Eisenhower understood that the rivalry between Patton and Montgomery was not merely a personal spat, but a reflection of the shifting global power dynamics where the United States was rapidly eclipsing Great Britain as the dominant Western power. In the headquarters of the 21st Army Group, the atmosphere was one of grim determination, as Montgomery's staff worked tirelessly to ensure that Operation Plunder would proceed with such overwhelming force that it would eventually silence any critics. The sheer logistical scale of Montgomery's operation remained unparalleled, with hundreds of thousands of British and Canadian troops moving into position behind a screen of smoke and steel that stretched for miles along the northern Rhine. As the massive artillery barrages continued to hammer German positions, the physical landscape of the riverbank was transformed into a wasteland of cratered earth and shattered timber, creating a hellish environment for the defending German paratroopers. Despite the overwhelming firepower, the resistance in the northern sector remained fierce, with the elite German 1st Fallschirmjäger Army fighting for every yard of muddy ground against the advancing British commandos. This stubborn resistance stood in sharp contrast to the rapid collapse of the German front in Patton's sector to the south, where the Third Army was already fanning out into the Hessian plains and capturing thousands of prisoners every hour. Patton, sensing that his window for historical immortality was widening, pushed his armored divisions to their absolute physical limits, demanding that they bypass pockets of resistance to maintain the speed of the advance. His orders were legendary for their lack of nuance, telling his tank commanders that they were not to worry about their flanks or their rear because the only direction that mattered was toward the heart of the Reich. As the month of March drew to a close, the narrative of the war was being written in two different languages: the methodical, heavy-handed prose of Montgomery's set-piece battle and the lightning-fast improvisational poetry of Patton's armored dash. In London, Winston Churchill watched the situation with a mixture of admiration for the American energy and a growing, heavy-hearted realization that the era of British military parity was coming to a definitive end. The Prime Minister spent hours in the cabinet war rooms, poring over maps that showed the American lines surging eastward, while the British forces were still engaged in the brutal business of clearing the Rhine floodplains. Churchill knew that for Britain to have a seat at the table in the post-war world, it needed a victory that was uniquely and undeniably British. But the more he looked at the progress of the Third Army, the more he feared that history would remember the Rhine crossing as an American triumph. This anxiety was shared by Field Marshal Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, who privately complained that the Americans were playing a game of one-upmanship that ignored the strategic necessity of a coordinated Allied front. The tension reached a boiling point during a high-level conference in early April, where the debate over the ultimate objective of the campaign, Berlin, became a surrogate for the personal rivalry between the commanders. Montgomery remained adamant that he should lead a single, concentrated thrust toward the German capital, arguing that it was a political necessity for the Western Allies to reach Berlin before the Soviet Red Army. However, Patton and Bradley were equally insistent that the war would be won by destroying the German military in the field, a task they believed the American armies were better equipped to handle given their superior mobility and supply chains. Eisenhower, weighing the enormous human cost of a race for Berlin against the strategic reality of the agreed-upon occupation zones, ultimately decided to shift the main Allied effort away from the capital, a move that Montgomery viewed as a personal insult. In the eyes of the British Field Marshal, this decision was the final confirmation that the Americans were prioritizing their own glory over the long-term political interests of the European alliance. Montgomery's frustration boiled over in a series of increasingly sharp communications to his superiors, leading to a moment where even his staunchest supporters in the British government began to fear that he was becoming a liability. It was during this period of intense diplomatic maneuvering that Winston Churchill decided he had heard enough from both of his warring generals and determined to deliver a verdict that would reset the priorities of the Allied command. The Prime Minister's intervention came during a private meeting where the topic of Patton's theft of Montgomery's thunder was once again raised by members of the British staff. Churchill, sitting amidst the swirling smoke of his trademark cigar, listened as his officers detailed the perceived slights and the media's obsession with Patton's speed compared to Montgomery's caution. Then, with the devastating wit and clarity that had defined his leadership during Britain's darkest hours, Churchill delivered a single line that silenced the room and eventually found its way into the memoirs of the men present. "My dear gentlemen," Churchill supposedly remarked with a weary smile, "it seems to me that while General Patton has been busy urinating into the Rhine to prove he has crossed it, Field Marshal Montgomery has been busy making sure the Rhine is still there for us to build a monument upon." This biting observation perfectly captured the absurdity of the rivalry, reminding his commanders that the objective was the destruction of Nazism, not the personal glorification of individual generals. The Prime Minister's words served as a cold shower for the British command, signaling that the time for petty grievances was over and that the focus must return to the final, bloody miles of the war. Despite Churchill's cooling influence, the competition on the ground continued to drive the pace of the invasion at an incredible rate, as both armies raced to capture as much territory as possible before the inevitable link-up with the Russians. The Third Army's advance across the central German hills was a masterpiece of logistics and leadership, as Patton moved thousands of tons of fuel and ammunition over hundreds of miles of captured territory. His divisions were now capturing major German cities like Frankfurt and Kassel, often arriving so quickly that the local Nazi administrators were still sitting at their desks when the first American Sherman tanks rolled into the town squares. Meanwhile, in the north, Montgomery's forces finally broke through the crust of the German defenses and began a massive sweep toward the Baltic coast and the Elbe River. The British 7th Armored Division, the famous Desert Rats, rediscovered the mobility that had served them so well in North Africa, racing across the North German plain to secure the vital ports of Bremen and Hamburg. The rivalry, though still simmering beneath the surface, had effectively served as a supercharger for the Allied war machine, pushing both nations to achieve feats of endurance that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. As the Allied armies neared the Elbe and the inevitable meeting with the Soviet forces, the strategic map of Europe was being redrawn in real time by the tracks of Allied tanks and the boots of Allied infantry. The Rhine crossing, once viewed as an insurmountable barrier, was now a memory, replaced by the grim reality of discovering the horrors of the Nazi concentration camps and the utter ruin of the German state. Patton and Montgomery both found themselves confronted with the human cost of the regime they had fought so hard to defeat, experiences that began to temper their personal ambitions with a sense of profound historical responsibility. In the final weeks of April 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed into a chaotic nightmare of street fighting and mass surrenders, the two generals were forced to coordinate their movements with a level of professionalism that had been missing in March. The realization that the war was truly ending brought a strange sort of peace to the Allied high command, as the immediate pressures of combat were replaced by the daunting challenges of occupation and reconstruction. Even Patton, whose public persona was built on the image of the tireless warrior, began to reflect on the nature of the alliance that had made victory possible, acknowledging in a letter to his wife that without the British holding the line in 1940, there would have been no Third Army to lead across the Rhine. The legacy of the Rhine crossing rivalry remains one of the most fascinating chapters of World War II history, illustrating the delicate balance between individual genius and collective effort. It was a moment where the personal flaws of great men, Patton's vanity and Montgomery's arrogance, collided with the grand sweep of global events, creating a drama that was as much about the human spirit as it was about military strategy. Today, the bridges across the Rhine stand as symbols of a unified Europe, but for those who study the spring of 1945, they remain the silent witnesses to a race that defined the end of the greatest conflict in human history. Ultimately, the victory belonged not to a single general or a single nation, but to the millions of ordinary soldiers who crossed that river under fire, whether they did so with Patton's stealth or Montgomery's thunder. As we look back on these titans of the battlefield, we are reminded that history is rarely a simple narrative of good versus evil, but a complex tapestry of ego, bravery, and the relentless pursuit of an end to the madness of war. The Rhine was crossed, the Reich was broken, and the world was changed forever, leaving us with the enduring question of how much of our history is shaped by the private battles fought between those who lead us. Given the immense pressure of the final months of World War II, do you believe Patton's aggressive cowboy tactics were more effective than Montgomery's methodical set-piece planning? Or did the Allies truly need both to break the Third Reich? Let us know your strategy in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.